The year is 1942. In the frozen trenches outside Stalingrad, a Soviet soldier named Ivan Petrov tears open a rectangular tin can. Inside sits a glistening block of pink meat. He has never seen anything like it. The label reads SPAM, spelled out in bold Latin letters that mean nothing to him. His commanding officer tells him this meat has travelled 6,000 miles from America, crossing submarine-infested waters, to reach this embattled city. Ivan takes his first bite. The taste of pork, salt, and something distinctly foreign fills his mouth. He does not yet know that this strange canned meat will become legendary among Soviet troops, earning a nickname that carries both gratitude and bitter irony. They will call it Second Front food. This is the story of how a humble American canned meat product became one of the most significant symbols of wartime alliance and tension between the United States and the Soviet Union. To understand why Soviet soldiers developed such a complex relationship with Spam, we must first travel back to the desperate early days of the war on the Eastern Front. On June 22, 1941, Operation Barbarossa shatters the early morning peace across the Soviet border. More than 3 million German troops pour into Soviet territory along an 1,800-mile front. The invasion catches Stalin's forces largely unprepared, despite numerous intelligence warnings that the dictator has chosen to ignore. Within weeks, the Wehrmacht advances hundreds of miles into Soviet territory, encircling entire armies, capturing millions of prisoners, and destroying vast quantities of military equipment and supplies. The speed and ferocity of the German advance creates an immediate and catastrophic crisis for the Soviet Union. Not only are military forces being decimated, but the agricultural heartland of the country falls under enemy occupation. The rich farmlands of Ukraine, the breadbasket of the Soviet Union, slip into German hands. Food production collapses. Supply lines disintegrate. The Soviet population, both military and civilian, faces the very real prospect of mass starvation, adding to the already staggering casualties of war. Stalin understands that the Soviet Union cannot survive this onslaught alone. Despite his deep ideological suspicion of capitalist nations, despite the memory of Western intervention during the Russian Civil War, despite the Munich Agreement and the period of the Nazi-Soviet Pact, he knows he needs help. He needs it desperately. He needs it immediately. The Soviet leader begins pressing Britain and the United States for assistance, starting a diplomatic campaign that will define the wartime alliance. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic Ocean, the United States watches the European war with growing concern but official neutrality. That neutrality shatters completely on December 7, 1941, when Japanese aircraft carriers launch their surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. Within days, Germany declares war on the United States. America finds itself in a global conflict on two fronts, allied with Britain and, remarkably, with the Soviet Union, against the Axis powers. President Franklin Roosevelt and his advisors face a strategic dilemma of staggering proportions. American military forces are not yet prepared for large-scale offensive operations in Europe. Building up the necessary armies, producing the weapons, training the troops, and organizing the logistics for an invasion of Nazi-occupied Europe will take years. Roosevelt knows this. His military commanders know this, and Stalin knows this too. But the Soviet Union is bleeding. Every day of delay means thousands more Soviet deaths, more territory lost, more cities destroyed. Stalin demands a second front in Western Europe immediately to draw German forces away from the Eastern Front. Roosevelt cannot deliver this. Not yet. What he can deliver is material support, massive quantities of food, weapons, vehicles, and raw materials to keep the Soviet Union fighting. This brings us to the creation of one of history's most remarkable logistical undertakings, the Lend-Lease program. Officially titled An Act to Promote the Defense of the United States, the Lend-Lease Act passes Congress in March 1941 before America even enters the war. The concept is elegant in its simplicity. The United States will lend or lease military and civilian supplies to any nation whose defense is deemed vital to American security. The recipient nations will not pay cash up front. Instead, they will return the goods after the war or provide payment at a later date to be determined. This arrangement allows Roosevelt to support Britain and later the Soviet Union without violating neutrality laws or requiring immediate payment from nearly bankrupt allies. When the Soviet Union becomes eligible for Lend-Lease assistance, the program begins modestly but quickly expands to enormous proportions. Over the course of the war, the United States will ship more than $11 billion worth of supplies to the Soviet Union, equivalent to approximately $180 billion in today's currency. These supplies include 7,000 tanks, 14,000 aircraft, 15 million pairs of boots, and enough railroad equipment to rebuild significant portions of the Soviet rail network. But among all these war materials, one category stands out for its immediate impact on Soviet morale and survival: food. American food aid to the Soviet Union during World War II reaches truly staggering dimensions. The United States ships 4.5 million tons of food products to Soviet ports and railheads between 1941 and 1945. This includes millions of pounds of flour, sugar, canned vegetables, and fats. But the single most iconic food item, the one that Soviet soldiers will remember for the rest of their lives, is Spam. Now, we need to understand what Spam actually is, and why American planners decide to ship millions of cans of this particular product to their Soviet allies. Spam is a branded canned pork product created by the Hormel Food Corporation in Austin, Minnesota. The company introduces it to the American market in 1937, just a few years before the war begins. The name itself is a portmanteau, possibly derived from spiced ham, though the exact origin remains disputed. The product consists of chopped pork shoulder meat with ham, salt, water, potato starch, sugar, and sodium nitrite. The mixture is pressed into rectangular cans, sealed, and then cooked inside the can, creating a shelf-stable product that requires no refrigeration and can last for years. For military planners, Spam represents an almost perfect solution to the problem of feeding armies in the field. It provides protein and calories in a compact, durable package. It does not spoil. It survives rough handling during transport. It requires no cooking, though it can be fried, baked, or boiled if facilities allow. A soldier can eat it cold, straight from the can with just a spoon or knife. In an era before sophisticated field rations, before freeze-dried meals and modern military logistics, Spam offers an elegant answer to an age-old problem. The United States military purchases Spam in quantities that boggle the mind. Hormel's production lines run 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, churning out millions of cans. The distinctive rectangular tins travel to every theatre of war where American and Allied forces operate. They go to North Africa, Italy, France, the Pacific Islands, Burma, and the Soviet Union. British soldiers eat Spam. American GIs eat Spam. Chinese nationalist troops eat Spam. And Soviet soldiers, in numbers exceeding 15 million men under arms at the war's peak, eat Spam. The logistics of getting Spam from Minnesota to the Eastern Front represent a triumph of organization and a testament to the brutal necessities of total war. The journey begins in American meatpacking plants, where workers process, can, and pack the product. The cans travel by rail to American ports on the east and west coasts. From there, they must cross either the Atlantic or the Pacific Ocean to reach Soviet territory. But the Soviet Union in wartime is nearly surrounded by enemies. The Germans occupy the western borders. The Black Sea is contested. The main Pacific port of Vladivostok, while technically safe from German attack, sits thousands of miles from the fighting fronts. American planners establish several major supply routes, each with its own dangers and difficulties. The northern route runs from American and British ports to Murmansk and Arkhangelsk in the Soviet Arctic. Convoys sailing this route must navigate the waters north of Norway, running a gauntlet of German U-boats, surface raiders, and aircraft operating from Norwegian bases. The waters are among the most treacherous on Earth. Storms can reach apocalyptic proportions. Ice forms on ship superstructures, threatening to capsize vessels. During the polar winter, darkness lasts nearly 24 hours a day. During summer, the midnight sun allows German pilots to attack at any hour. Ships sink in freezing water where survival time can be measured in minutes. Entire convoys suffer devastating losses. Convoy PQ 17 inches. July 1942 loses 24 of 35 merchant ships to German attacks. The Persian Corridor offers an alternative route, albeit one almost as difficult. Ships sail from American ports through the South Atlantic, around the Cape of Good Hope, or through the Mediterranean, if conditions allow, and into the Persian Gulf. Cargo unloads at Iranian ports, particularly Bandar Shahpur and Khorramshahr. From there, supplies must travel overland by truck and rail through Iran into Soviet Central Asia. The infrastructure barely exists at the start of the term. Program. American and British engineers work with Iranian and Soviet counterparts to expand port facilities, build new roads, lay railroad tracks, and organize vast motor transport columns. The heat of the Iranian desert replaces the Arctic cold of the Murmansk Run, but proves equally punishing. Trucks break down, drivers struggle with unfamiliar terrain, local politics complicate operations. Yet supplies flow, slowly but steadily northward. The Pacific route, running from American West Coast ports to Vladivostok, eventually becomes the most important supply line of all. The Soviet Union maintains neutrality with Japan until the final months of the war, which means Japanese forces do not attack Soviet shipping in the Pacific. Soviet-flagged vessels can sail relatively safely from American ports to Vladivostok, though the journey spans thousands of miles and takes weeks. Once cargo reaches Vladivostok, it faces another monumental challenge: transport across the vastness of Siberia on the Trans-Siberian Railway to European Russia, where the fighting rages. This single rail line, spanning nearly 6,000 miles, becomes one of the most critical logistics arteries of the entire war. Through all these routes, the cans of spam travel. They sit in the holds of Liberty ships, pitching through Atlantic storms. They cross scorching Iranian deserts in the backs of Studebaker trucks, themselves lend-lease items. They ride the Trans-Siberian Railway for weeks, clicking along rails as the landscape shifts from Pacific coast to Siberian forest to the Ural Mountains to European Russia. And finally, they reach the front lines where Soviet soldiers wait in muddy trenches, snow-covered bunkers, and shell-cratered ruins. The first Soviet soldiers to encounter spam react with surprise, suspicion, and curiosity. Red Army rations at this point in the war are austere at best and catastrophically inadequate at worst. A Soviet soldier in the field is officially entitled to 800 grams of bread per day, supplemented with kasha, dried fish when available, some vegetables, and occasionally small amounts of meat. In practice, supply breakdowns mean soldiers often receive far less. They supplement their rations with whatever they can scavenge, forage, or receive from local populations. Hunger is a constant companion for many Red Army troops, especially during the desperate defensive battles of 1941 and 1942. Into this context arrives this strange rectangular can with its exotic English labelling. Soviet soldiers have never seen anything quite like it. The packaging itself seems almost luxurious compared to Soviet military issue items. The can opener, the key that winds around to peel back the metal lid, represents a minor marvel of engineering to troops accustomed to opening cans with bayonets and knives. The meat inside, pressed into a perfect rectangular block, seems impossibly uniform and processed. Nothing in Soviet food. Production looks like this. The taste provokes equally strong reactions. The saltiness hits first, followed by the distinctive flavor of processed pork and the subtle spices in the mixture. For soldiers half-starved and surviving on black bread and thin soup, spam tastes like abundance, like richness, like the food of a nation that has not known hunger and siege. Some soldiers love it immediately, savoring every bite and treasuring each can they receive. Others find it strange, too salty, too processed, too foreign. But almost everyone recognizes it as calories, as protein, as energy to keep fighting in the brutal conditions of the Eastern Front. Soviet officers distribute the American canned meat according to military necessity and available supply. Frontline combat units receive priority. Tank crews, operating the American-supplied Sherman tanks, sometimes get Spam along with their machines, creating a complete package of American military aid. Guards units, the elite formations, that earn honors through battlefield success, see more Lend-Lease supplies than regular formations. Rear area troops and support units receive less, continuing to subsist primarily on Soviet-produced rations. This distribution pattern creates a complex psychology around Lend-Lease food. It becomes associated with elite status, with being valued, with being on the sharp end of the fight where the best equipment goes. As millions of cans flow into Soviet hands, soldiers begin developing their own traditions and techniques around Spam. They discover that frying it in precious cooking oil or animal fat creates a crispy exterior that changes the texture dramatically. They learn to slice it thin to make small amounts go further. They combine it with potatoes when available, creating more substantial meals. Some units use it as a trading commodity, bartering Spam for vodka, tobacco, or other desired items. Enterprising soldiers sometimes sell it to civilians, though this black market trade is officially forbidden and harshly punished when discovered. The nickname Second Front emerges from the frontline troops themselves, and it carries layers of meaning that American suppliers never intended. When Soviet soldiers call Spam and other Lend-Lease food items Second Front, they are making a bitter political joke. Stalin has been demanding that America and Britain open a second front in Western Europe since late 1941. He wants Allied armies landing in France, fighting Germans, drawing divisions away from the Eastern Front, where Soviet forces face the overwhelming bulk of Wehrmacht combat power. Churchill and Roosevelt promise this second front repeatedly, but delays continue. North Africa comes first, then Sicily, then Italy. The actual landing in France, Operation Overlord, does not occur until June 6, 1944, nearly 3 years into the Soviet-German War. From the Soviet perspective, especially from Stalin's viewpoint and the propaganda presented to Soviet citizens and soldiers, these delays seem calculated. Stalin suspects, not entirely without reason, that the Western Allies are content to let Germany and the Soviet Union bleed each other white, planning to step in only when both are exhausted. Whether this interpretation is fair remains historically debatable. The Allies face genuine challenges in mounting a cross-channel invasion and suffer their own significant casualties in the Mediterranean theatre. But Stalin's suspicion is real, and it filters down through the Red Army ranks. So when Soviet soldiers open their cans of Spam, they make the connection. This food is what we get instead of the Second Front. This meat is America's contribution while we die by the millions. The nickname is sardonic, even bitter, but it is not entirely ungrateful. The soldiers understand, perhaps better than the political leaders, that Spam keeps them alive. The food provides calories when Soviet supply lines fail. It delivers protein when meat becomes impossible to obtain. It offers reliability in a world of chaos and deprivation. The nickname Second Front acknowledges both the vital importance of this aid and the resentment that it arrives as a substitute for direct military cooperation that could save Soviet lives more effectively. This complex mixture of gratitude and resentment appears throughout the Soviet relationship with Lend-Lease. Stalin himself delivers perhaps the most famous assessment. During the Tehran Conference in 1943, in a moment of unusual candor aided by alcohol and the bonhomie of the Allied summit, Stalin reportedly tells American and British leaders that the Soviet Union could not have survived without Lend-Lease aid. Soviet General Georgy Zhukov, probably the most important military commander in defeating Germany, writes in his memoirs that Lend-Lease gave the Soviet Union the ability to concentrate on weapons production, while America supplied vehicles, food, and other essentials. He specifically mentions Spam and other canned meats as crucial for feeding the armies. But this acknowledgement exists alongside official Soviet propaganda that minimizes or even erases the contribution of Allied aid. During the war, for morale and political purposes, Soviet media emphasizes the independent strength and capability of the Red Army and Soviet industry. Lend-Lease receives mention, but its importance is downplayed. After the war, as the Cold War freeze sets in, Soviet historiography becomes even more reluctant to credit American and British assistance. The official narrative becomes that the Soviet Union defeated Nazi Germany essentially alone through the superiority of socialist organization and the heroism of the Soviet people. Mentioning that millions of Soviet soldiers were kept fed partly by American spam fits poorly into this narrative. The soldiers themselves, however, remember. They remember spam specifically and Lend-Lease generally with complicated feelings that resist simple categorization. In the post-war years, as the Soviet Union and the United States transform from allies into Cold War adversaries, Soviet veterans still recall opening those rectangular cans. They remember the taste. They remember the abundance that the cans represented, products of an industrial system that could produce such items by the millions and ship them halfway around the world, while simultaneously building its own vast military force. For soldiers who knew the harsh reality of Soviet wartime production, who saw the desperation and improvisation and ruthless prioritization of weapons over everything else, the simple existence of Lend-Lease food spoke volumes about the different nature of the American economy. The numbers tell part of the story, but cannot convey its full human significance. The United States ships more than 600 million pounds of canned meat to the Soviet Union during the war. Spam constitutes a substantial portion of this total, though exact figures for spam specifically versus other canned meat products are difficult to establish from surviving records. These millions of cans represent billions of calories that keep soldiers fighting, workers producing, and civilians surviving. The aid comes at a time when Soviet food production has collapsed, when millions face starvation in besieged cities like Leningrad, when agricultural regions lie under occupation or devastated by scorched earth warfare. Beyond mere calories, the psychological impact of Lend-Lease food deserves consideration. When Soviet soldiers receive American products, when they handle cans with English labels, when they taste food manufactured in a country they have been told is capitalist and imperialist, it creates cognitive dissonance. The propaganda says America is exploitative and selfish, yet here is evidence of aid on a monumental scale. The political leadership says Soviet self-sufficiency is paramount, yet the food they eat travels from Minnesota and Chicago. These contradictions do not necessarily turn soldiers into capitalists or make them question Soviet ideology wholesale, but they plant seeds of doubt and create a more nuanced understanding of the world than official propaganda intends. American soldiers and civilians, meanwhile, largely remain unaware of how their food is being received by Soviet allies. The American home front knows about Lend-Lease in general terms. They understand that supplies go to Britain and the Soviet Union. They accept rationing partly as a sacrifice to ensure allies receive support. But the specific details, the intimate reality of Soviet soldiers opening spam cans in frozen trenches or bomb-shattered cities, remain invisible to most Americans. The propaganda posters show American and Soviet soldiers shaking hands, Allied flags flying together. But the actual lived experience of the alliance, with all its complications and contradictions, exists far from American awareness. The encounter between Soviet soldiers and American spam also illustrates the broader meeting of two radically different societies through the medium of material aid. The United States in the 1940s is an industrial powerhouse whose production capacity seems almost unlimited. American factories produce goods in quantities that stagger the imagination. The country has developed sophisticated systems of branding, packaging, marketing, and distribution that are visible even in military products. Spam is not just meat. It is a branded product with distinctive packaging, with advertising behind it, with a corporate identity. It emerges from an economic system built around consumer choice and mass production for civilian markets. The Soviet Union operates according to completely different principles. Stalin's forced industrialization of the 1930s builds heavy industry and military production at tremendous human cost, but largely neglects consumer goods. Soviet citizens do not shop for competing brands. They receive what the state provides through rationing systems and state stores. Packaging is utilitarian at best. The concept of corporate branding barely exists. Soviet soldiers, products of this system, encounter in Spam a physical embodiment of capitalist consumer culture adapted for military purposes. Some Soviet troops who survive the war and live into the post-Soviet era will later describe Spam as their first encounter with what they come to recognize as Western consumer culture. The can itself, the branding, the standardization, the implicit promise of abundance behind a product that comes in such quantities all point toward a system organized very differently from their own. This recognition does not happen all at once or universally, but it percolates through experiences and memories. The interaction between Soviet needs and American production also reveals the asymmetry of the wartime alliance. The United States provides material aid, but, until June 1944, relatively few combat troops on the ground in Europe. The Soviet Union provides millions of soldiers who do the bulk of the fighting and dying to destroy the Wehrmacht, but desperately needs the material support that only America can supply in sufficient quantities. This asymmetry creates mutual dependence but also mutual resentment. Americans feel their generosity is unappreciated and that Soviets ignore the difficulties of mobilizing and shipping aid. Soviets feel they are dying in vast numbers while Americans profit from the war and delay risking their own troops in significant numbers in Europe. The opening of the genuine Second Front in Normandy in June 1944 changes the dynamic somewhat, but does not entirely resolve the tension. Soviet forces are advancing rapidly by this point, having already turned the tide of the war through victories at Stalingrad, Kursk, and in the subsequent offensives that push German armies westward. When American, British, and Canadian forces land in France, Soviet soldiers certainly recognize this as helpful, as drawing German divisions westward, as accelerating the inevitable defeat of Nazi Germany. But the nickname Second Front for Spam and Lend-Lease food persists, carrying its load of historical irony now layered with the reality that the actual Second Front has finally arrived. The end of the war in Europe in May 1945 brings victory but also brings the rapid cooling of the alliance. Lend-Lease does not end immediately, but within months the United States begins cutting back shipments dramatically. The program officially ends in September 1945. The final accounting of Lend-Lease debts becomes a source of tension. The Soviet Union argues that the sacrifices its people made in blood far outweigh any material debt. The United States argues that while Soviet sacrifices are acknowledged, the Lend-Lease agreement calls for eventual payment. Negotiations drag on for decades, never reaching full resolution until the post-Soviet period, when the Russian Federation finally settles remaining debts. Soviet veterans carry their memories of Spam and other Lend-Lease items into peacetime. In the Khrushchev years, when de-Stalinization allows somewhat more honest discussion of the war, some veterans speak more openly about Allied aid. In the Brezhnev era, when war memoirs and histories proliferate, Lend-Lease receives occasional acknowledgement, though always carefully contextualized to maintain the primacy of Soviet achievement. In the Gorbachev-Glasnost period, and then in post-Soviet Russia, the topic opens up considerably. Veterans give interviews where they speak frankly about how important American trucks, food, and equipment were to Soviet victory. The official taboo around crediting Allied material aid finally breaks down. Meanwhile, Spam itself becomes a global phenomenon, though its reception varies enormously by culture and region. In the United States, it becomes associated with working-class diets, and eventually, with a kind of ironic appreciation for mid-century American processed foods. In the Pacific, particularly in Hawaii, Guam, and the Philippines, Spam becomes genuinely beloved, incorporated into local cuisines in ways that would astonish Minnesota meatpackers. In Britain, it remains a familiar, if not particularly celebrated, part of food culture, a reminder of wartime austerity. But nowhere does Spam carry quite the historical and emotional weight that it does in the former Soviet Union. Russian veterans, in their twilight years, remember Second Front with smiles and headshakes. They tell their grandchildren stories about opening those cans in the snow outside Moscow, in the ruins of Stalingrad, during the long advances westward toward Berlin. They describe the taste, still vivid in memory after decades. They explain the nickname and the complicated feelings it represented. Some tracked down Spam in the post-Soviet period when Western products flooded into Russian stores, buying a can out of curiosity and nostalgia, wondering if it tastes the same as they remember. Usually it does. The product has remained remarkably consistent across the decades. Historians studying the Eastern Front and the Soviet war effort have increasingly recognized the crucial importance of Lend-Lease, including food aid, to Soviet survival and eventual victory. The romantic notion that Soviet forces defeated Nazi Germany through sheer courage and suffering alone gives way to more nuanced understanding. Courage and suffering there certainly were, in quantities almost impossible to comprehend, with over 27 million Soviet citizens dead by war's end. But courage alone does not move armies, feed soldiers, or transport supplies. Material support matters. Logistics matters. And in this war of unprecedented scale and brutality, American material aid, symbolized by humble cans of Spam, helped keep the Soviet Union in the fight during the darkest hours and supported the massive offensives that finally destroyed Hitler's military machine. The story of Soviet troops and Spam also reminds us that history operates simultaneously at multiple levels. At the highest level, we have grand strategy, diplomatic negotiations, the decisions of Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin that shape the war's course. At another level, we have logistics and economics, the mobilization of industrial capacity, the organization of global supply lines, the production of millions of tons of war material. But at the most human level, we have individual soldiers, hungry and cold and far from home, opening a can with a strange label and tasting something that connects them, however briefly, to a distant country and a different way of life. The nickname Second Front captures this multi-layered reality perfectly. It is simultaneously a joke, a complaint, an acknowledgement of reality, and an expression of gratitude. It recognizes political tensions while accepting material necessity. It allows soldiers to critique their leaders' diplomacy while appreciating the food that keeps them alive. The phrase, like the product it describes, travels across cultural and ideological boundaries, creating unexpected connections in the midst of total war. In the final analysis, the story of Spam on the Eastern Front is a story about alliance under stress, about the meeting of radically different societies, about the importance of logistics in modern warfare, and about how ordinary objects can carry extraordinary historical significance. Those millions of rectangular cans, each one seemingly trivial, collectively represent a crucial lifeline that helped sustain Soviet resistance at its most desperate moment. They embody American industrial capacity and logistical capability. They symbolize the complicated partnership between the United States and Soviet Union, united, against a common enemy despite deep ideological differences and mutual suspicions. When we remember World War II, we naturally focus on the great battles, the turning points, the dramatic moments that decided the conflict. Stalingrad, Kursk, D-Day, the fall of Berlin. These events deserve their prominent place in history. But wars are won not only through battles, but through the unglamorous work of keeping armies supplied, fed, and equipped. The soldiers who fought at Stalingrad needed ammunition for their rifles, fuel for their tanks, and food in their bellies. Some of that food came from Minnesota in rectangular cans, traveled 6,000 miles through submarine-infested seas, or across Persian deserts or over Siberian rails, and arrived at the front lines as a small but vital contribution to victory. The Soviet soldiers who called Spam Second Front were wiser than perhaps they knew. They understood that the alliance fighting Nazi Germany had many fronts, not just geographic, ones but material, economic, and industrial. The second front, they sardonically named, was real, though not in the form Stalin demanded. It was a front of farms and factories, of cargo ships and railroads, of mobilized production capacity and organizational capability. It was not the front of soldiers storming beaches, but it was no less essential to victory. Today, the generation that fought World War II has nearly passed from the earth. The youngest veterans are now nearly 100 years old. Soon, all the men and women who opened those spam cans in frozen Soviet trenches will be gone, and their direct memories will go with them. But the story remains, preserved in memoirs and interviews, in historical records and analyses, in the collective memory of nations. The story of Second Front, of American spam, shocking and sustaining Soviet soldiers, tells us something important about war and alliance, about material culture and historical memory, about how the grand sweep of history connects to the intimate experience of individual human beings trying to survive and prevail in circumstances of unimaginable difficulty. The rectangular cans with their English labels that once seemed so foreign in Soviet hands have become historical artifacts now, symbols of a time when the world teetered on the brink and unlikely allies joined forces against a common threat. They remind us that even in the darkest times, connection across difference is possible, that mutual survival can overcome ideological division, and that sometimes history hinges not on grand gestures, but on the simple act of feeding an army, one can of spam at a time.